Hello, everybody. We'll be getting started with today's webinar momentarily. Hello, everybody. We'll be getting started just in a few minutes. Thank you for joining. Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, How Leaders Can Navigate Unpredictable Situations. We're delighted to have so many of you join us live, and I'll know you'll be glad that you did. My name is Jesse Fry, and I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Singularity University, and have the distinct privilege of moderating today's webinar. Singularity University is about bold and courageous leadership. Singularity convenes, connects, guides, and supports those who aspire to play an active role in creating a better, more equitable future for all. We teach leaders how to prepare and thrive in a rapidly changing and uncertain future fueled by exponential technologies. First, please tell us a little bit about yourself in the chat, such as where you're from. Great, so many different locations from around the world. Thank you so much for sharing. Today's webinar is an extension from our 3-day COVID virtual summit we held a few weeks ago. In today's session, Catherine and Chipp will talk about leading through unpredictable situations. They will introduce some new models of thinking that will help you and your teams in these unprecedented times. We'll save 15 minutes to answer your questions at the end of the webinar, but you don't have to wait until the end to ask your questions. You can use the Q&A button to submit your questions as they occur to you throughout the presentation. We are incredibly fortunate to have Catherine Brown and Chipp Norcross speaking in today's session. Catherine is our Vice President of Executive Education here at Singularity University, and Chipp has held many hats at Singularity University. However, he is currently our Vice President of Enterprise Solutions. I want to cover a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. All participants will be muted throughout the duration of the presentation to ensure the best quality for all. During the presentation, if you encounter any audio issues, please refresh your browser and check your computer's audio settings. Again, submit your questions anytime during the webinar. Just click the Q&A button to do so. Lastly, we are recording today's webinar and we'll share the link with you in the follow-up. That way you can listen to it again and even share it with others who may be interested. Okay, we're gonna get started. Take it away, Catherine and Chipp.
All right, hi, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome to our webinar on complexity theory, how leaders can navigate unpredictable situations. I'm really thrilled to be here with my colleague, Catherine Brown, and we share a common passion around this idea of complexity theory that I developed over the years of working in the fields of innovation and particularly in my past working at a company called Synectics. And Catherine, you really, when you came to Singularity, you brought this really interesting history of using complexity theory as part of the leadership development programs that you were running at Google. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you became so fascinated with this approach to being able to manage through unpredictable situations?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. Thrilled to be talking about this topic with Chipp. It's one of the areas of passion of mine. And as he mentioned, I first got involved with this sort of area of work when I was at Google in executive development, working with leaders at Google. And what I would say is what we were noticing at that time is the types of challenges and obstacles that leaders were facing were becoming more and more complex. And I would argue that that's happening in the world at large, especially right now. And so I began to be really interested in this space of complexity and how one can navigate complexity effectively. And since then, I've just been more and more immersed in understanding the concepts from complexity theory and applying them with a leadership lens. So that's what I hope to talk about today.
So as we start to talk about this, Catherine, we both use the word complexity a number of times already. Can you define what that is? Because it is a word that is really important that we have a shared understanding for this conversation, and it might be different than how we use it in normal day-to-day conversation.
Yeah, it's a good point. In the space of complexity theory, language is really important, and things have very specific meanings. So I'll start with sort of the definition of complexity in the context that I'm going to be using. And to do that, I like to draw a little bit of a contrast. So if I think about the way we historically or used to organize information, I'm gonna bring up this image. And this image is of a card catalog. This probably dates me because this was one way we organized information as I was growing up, kind of the Google of yesteryear, I suppose. And what's great about this system is that it was really reliable and really straightforward. You would go and find a card inside this catalog, a series of numbers, in the library. You'd go to that specific place, you could find the book that you were looking for. This was a straightforward process. It was repeatable. You could rely on it. You knew it was going to happen the same way each time you went. But as things have evolved, and if you think about this as a way of sort of framing and structuring our organization of information, the world has evolved sort of exponentially. And I like this cartoon because it sort of exemplifies what I'm talking about here, which is sometimes we think we're going on a path that's pretty straight and we know where it's headed and we think it's pretty predictable, but then something happens, some sort of exponential growth or disruption happens, and we end up in a place that's very different than where we were before and we didn't see it coming. So if you think about the card catalog and the Dewey Decimal System as one way to organize information from yesteryear, and then we think about how we organize it today. So this is really more our world today. This image is a really interesting infographic, and what it is a representation of 5% of the information on Wikipedia 5 years ago. So it represents 250,000 articles with over 10 million connections, and again, just 5%. And you can see in this image how there are nodes that are bigger than others. That's clusters of information that are related. You can see connections with those lines, their interconnectivity. It's a really interesting image, and if you go to that wikiverse.io, you can actually manipulate and move it and play with it and see all the different connections. But I like this because I think it amplifies the kind of complexity that we're dealing with now, really, in our world. So if we think about that, it's clear that if our world is evolving to a place that's going to be more complex, we need to evolve as well because we know things are going to be looking differently.
So as we think about how to interact in a world that's more complex, you've got a really fascinating framework that you use in conversations when you're teaching here at SU and working with people to help them understand what is a complex challenge and how are those different from the other kinds of challenges that we might be running into on a day-to-day basis. So can we spend some time digging into that?
Absolutely. So the model that I have found really useful is from an expert named David Snowden, and his model is called the Cynefin Model. It's a Welsh word, so it's spelled a little funny, but basically the loose translation of this is a sense of place or habitat. And Dave Snowden describes this as a sense-making tool and a way to understand where you are. So let me walk you through the model, and I think it'll help us sort of bring to life what we mean when we say complex. So the first distinction in this model is on the left-hand side, the land of the unpredictable, and on the right-hand side, the land of the predictable. In this model, I should say that the vertical axis, actually, they don't have labels. He didn't name them. Think of them more as dividers between the categories on that side. So let's start with this first domain. So the domain of the obvious is where there is clear cause and effect. This is the space of best practice. This is where we categorize things and then we can apply a solution that's pretty known to everybody. So similar to that card catalog system, this is the space where you know that you can push a button and something will happen. You push the button, again, the exact same thing will happen. This is the land of automation, processes, things that we all know and we know how to do them. So basically, when we are in this space, this is a place where we know that like, for example, checking into a hotel. We know we go to a front desk of a hotel, we're going to give them identification, they're going to give us a key, and then we go to the hotel room. So we know that that's the process that's going to happen over and over again. So that's the space of the obvious. That's on the land of the predictable. The second domain on the predictable side is complicated. So in the land of the complicated, expertise might be needed to see cause and effect. And this is the space of good practice. So in this space, you analyze, you apply expertise, and then you solve the problem. So this is the space of process, protocol, checklists, and like I said, it might require expertise, but there is a known solution. Now on the other side of the model, this is where complexity lives. So on the unpredictable side, in complexity, cause and effect is there, but can usually only be seen in hindsight. So it's very difficult in the moment to see it. This is the land of what we refer to as emergent practice. So because there's unpredictability, you have to kind of evolve along with the challenge. And in complexity, the approach that's most helpful is experimentation. So you experiment, you learn, and then you use those learnings to move in a different direction. And the idea in complexity is about going in a direction as opposed to achieving a destination. And then the last domain he talks about is chaos. So in chaos, there's no relationship to cause and effect. This is what he calls a novel practice. And this is where you triage and then figure out next steps. Some of us have heard recently with the pandemic going on, they referred to as the novel virus, the novel COVID virus. And that really refers to the fact that we've never experienced it before. And in chaos, that's exactly what's happening. So in chaos, you really don't have the time to analyze or to categorize or anything. You just have to act to sort of triage the situation. And this would be a space that you try to spend as minimal time as possible in. So those are the 4 domains. The last things I want to take you through in the model is this one on the cliff. So this is a really interesting thing. That little line at the bottom is quite intentional. And what this represents is a dynamic that can sometimes occur, which is if you are operating in the obvious space and become complacent, become automated, and kind of relax too much, if you fail to acknowledge and recognize the shifts in the context and the landscape around you, you can find yourself in chaos. So this looks like when organizations miss trends in the marketplace and end up becoming obsolete, then they need to scramble to sort of reinvent themselves. That's what that cliff represents. And then lastly, disorder. So disorder is what he names the middle of this model. And the reason is it's the place from which you may not know actually what domain you're dealing with. So it's a little bit paralyzing and can slow things down if there's either disagreement or a lack of understanding in terms of what domain we're actually dealing with, then you have disorder. So I find this model really helpful to give some language around it. And it's how I have sort of in my head brought some definition to these terms.
So, I really like this model a lot. And when we first sat down and talked about it, it helped me to make a lot of sense of the work that I had been doing previously and around the innovation space, and particularly how so many things that were truly complex challenges, people were treating as if they were complicated, like there was a formula that we should be able to use to solve them. And I think about, a topic we've talked about is the difference between figuring out how to get a rocket to launch a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth, as we know is the famous mission that was stated, versus how do you organize the supply chain and the people to be able to build the rocket and source the materials and prepare to be able to launch, which is much more complex than complicated. Just from my experience of, even if we acknowledge it's complex, those complicated tendencies that we learn that we're kind of taught during school, of all of our math tests, all of our science quizzes, are really at play so much of the time. And we want to ask everyone who's listening to this call to weigh in on a question, which is, if you look through these different areas of obvious practice, complicated, complex, and chaos, which is the one that you're most comfortable operating in? So we're going to open up the poll right now. We'll give everybody about 30 seconds to respond. Are you most comfortable operating in a world that is obvious, a world that is complicated, where there is a right answer, you just need to be able to figure out how to solve it? A world that's complex, where there might not be a right answer, but you can make progress towards improving? Or the world of chaos, one where there is no relationship of cause and effect and you're having to figure it out as you go? So I see some people who are putting their answers into the chat. there should be a poll also, and if you can answer in the poll, then we'll be able to see everyone's results. Poll should have popped up right in the middle of your screen.
And it is the case, Chip, that we tend to have one that we're more comfortable with than the others, one that resonates with us a little more.
So, all right, we are to the results. Very interesting. So a little bit more than half are more comfortable in complex, and around a little bit less than half, 40% comfortable in complicated. Catherine, as you look at that, does that compare with the results? How does that compare with the results that you've seen in the past when you've asked this question?
Yeah, I'd say that it's probably a little bit higher of folks on this call who are comfortable navigating complexity, but obviously there's opt-in bias at action, so that doesn't really surprise me. But it's definitely consistent that we usually see a big percentage of folks who are comfortable in the complicated space. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the distinction between complex and complicated, but these results don't surprise me terribly, but I'm happy to see that there are a lot of you who are comfortable in the land of complexity.
Yeah, and I do want to just make a comment. Somebody had put in here, put a human on the moon. That is accurate. I was actually just quoting President Kennedy, who put that exact mission statement out in the world of putting a man in the moon and returning him safely to Earth. But I do appreciate the perspective on that, and thank you for clarifying. So our next question on here would be that if you now think about what you're most comfortable in, and you change your perspective to say, what is the one that you're most being asked to live in the role that you spend the most of your time in at work, or it might be at home, or it might be wherever, where do you feel like you're getting pulled in your day-to-day life to operate in the world of the obvious, operate in the world of the complicated, the complex, or the chaos? So again, that should be on a poll that would have popped up in the middle of your screen. All right. About an equal split between complex and complicated here. Be interesting to see who might have migrated, although we don't have that ability here on this poll. But Catherine, what are your thoughts seeing this?
Yeah, I think I would have expected that we'd see the complex percentage increase. I'm a little surprised to see that it decreased. Not surprised, however, when I think about what many of us are probably dealing with right now because of the lens of a pandemic, in terms of having to take action that's informed, having to create new policies, new procedures, new protocols. A lot of that work lives in the land of the complicated. So part of me is surprised, part of me is not surprised. I think it would be interesting too to think about how you would have answered this question pre-COVID-19 pandemic versus now. And if things have changed, I would imagine for many of us, myself included, a lot of what we're doing has had to evolve and change as a result of the circumstances. But yeah, really interesting. The other interesting thing I'd say is we saw chaos go up, right? Wasn't it around 6% in the first question? So while very few of us are truly comfortable and feel like our sort of sweet spot is in chaos, many of us are being asked to operate that way right now, which makes a lot of sense.
So, as we reflect on these polls, then we've got a couple of people in the chat already have said that this is a great clarifying model on complexity and chaos to be able to understand, how to separate these differences. How can we start to embody these as leaders, these differences? Because it's great to know, but then what do we do about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what I'll say is, as a leader, I have found this framework really helpful in not necessarily categorizing things around me, but in helping me make sense of what it is I'm dealing with. Because what I found through my experience working with thousands of leaders all around the world is it's really easy to sort of misdiagnose or to make assumptions on what kind of challenge you're dealing with and apply solutions that actually are sort of a mismatch. And I'd say the place that I see this most is really in this distinction between complicated and complex. So let's take a look at those two specifically and understand the distinctions. So like I said, in the complicated landscape, a right answer exists, but you often need expertise to uncover it. So those experts might take different paths to arrive at their destination, but they usually arrive at the same answer. In the space of the complicated, you have to gather data and analyze. This is where the place of consultants and specialists is really useful. And having a mindset that's fairly black and white of problem solving, let me get to the root cause, find the solution, is actually really useful. And I say that because I want to make a distinction about the sort of what can feel like an evaluative judgment on these things. So I want to make it clear that it's not that the land of the complicated is bad and the land of the complex is good, or that every leader needs to always apply sort of complex thinking. It's really a matter of understanding where you are and choosing an intervention that's going to be most effective. So in the complicated space, and we absolutely need to have that mindset in certain circumstances, the problem solving black and white is really useful. If you contrast that, however, with the complex landscape, in complexity, there's really no right answer or solution. So this is the space where really what you're trying to do is head in a direction and watch the signals that you're going in the right way, as opposed to arriving at a destination. So you need to be able to see the system. For those of you who are familiar with the work of adaptive leadership out of Harvard, they talk about adaptive versus technical. So adaptive challenges and technical problems, very similar concepts. So in adaptive leadership, one of the ideas is about getting on the balcony so you can actually see the whole system at play. And in complexity, that's really valuable. It's very difficult to be able to see the interconnectivities when you're in the thick of it. So taking moments as a leader to step back so you can actually see all of the sort of influencers in the system and the way things are connected is really important. In complexity, there are usually many moving parts and interdependencies. One of the dynamics of complex systems that they talk about is this concept that small changes can have outsized impacts. So you can move a lever over here, not knowing the impact it's going to have, and see an unexpected change over here as a result. So this is the space where a mindset of curiosity is really effective. So running experiments, learning as you go, evolving your thinking, it's a very different mindset. And for many of us, it's unsettling. And for many of us, the reason is we were raised in environments where we were heavily rewarded for having expert problem solving skills, right? Certainly in Western world, our education systems are quite often based on this idea of achieving the right answer. And you get a gold star for achieving the right answer. So it's no surprise that there are many of us, and in this group, it looked like about half of you, who are pretty comfortable operating in the complicated landscape. You're comfortable gathering data and analyzing, providing different solutions, and finding the right one. And that feels very comfortable for many of us. But you can see that if that were my mindset for everything, and I found myself in a complex challenge trying to apply that problem-solving mindset, it usually leads to feeling stuck and frustrated. And that's what I was noticing with a lot of the leaders I was working with was, gosh, they'd say things like, I don't know, this used to work. I've been able to do it this way for years. And all of a sudden it feels like I'm just stuck and I'm not making forward progress. And quite often that's because they're applying this problem solving mindset and interventions that are consistent with that to something that really requires experimentation and a very different approach. So I like this. I think it's helpful to talk about this distinction because this is the place where I think I see the most friction.
Yeah, and I think that digging into this difference is so important. There's, in the complicated side of things, it is the scientific method, right, that often is the one to use. Where on the complex side of things, it is like a creative problem solving approach and methodology. And I know that's one question that comes up a lot, like what are the tools to use to be able to solve complex challenges? We often point to things more like design thinking, not necessarily design thinking is the only way, but the sense of experimentation and empathy building and testing and refining that you see in design thinking or in synectics or in other creative problem solving tools and methodologies that that we've seen pop up over the last 50 years, I would say.
Yes.
I think this is a great time to ask our audience to reflect on this difference and ask what might be some complex challenges, as you've heard them described here in the last few minutes, that perhaps you've been treating or your organization might have been treating as complicated. So using more of a mindset of scientific method problem solving to solve a problem that really is complex and needs a lot more, a different way of approaching it. So we're going to
And
ask.
while you're doing that, actually, Chip, it occurred to me, I didn't give many examples that might be helpful to get people's minds thinking about it. So things that are process driven and procedural would live in the complicated land, whereas any movements or any attempts to get human beings to change their behavior lives squarely in the land of complexity. And that's because we're complex organisms, right? I can ask you a question today, Chip, you have an answer. I can ask you the exact same question tomorrow, and there is no way with absolute certainty I know you're going to give me the same answer. You could say something different. So as unpredictable beings, any effort that requires or that includes trying to get people to do something differently lands in the world of complexity. So anything around diversity and inclusion, anything around human behavior. I would say some of the big challenges our world is seeing right now around things like climate change, that's really complex. There are interconnectivities, there are pressures in the system, there are dynamics at play that are unpredictable. It evolves as it happens. So if that's helpful for some color, those are some examples maybe helpful.
Yeah, that's great. And we've got people already putting things into the chat. So again, if there's something that you have seen being treated as if it were complicated, but you believe after, well, before or after hearing Catherine's description, you think is really more complex, please put it in the chat. Some of the things that are popping up in here, change management,
Yes,
being managed
that's a big one. Reorgs.
Way. Helping people in developing countries move into digital banking, climate change mitigation and adaptation. In healthcare, we teach to complicated clinical protocols, yet patients present with the complex. COVID is a great example. I often think of complex as a differentiator between leading and managing. On a team, currently on a team drafting a national AI strategy and trying to deliver a deeper concept, quite complex. Raising children, yes, that is.
Yes.
Is something I think
definitely
relate to. Leadership.
I will say too, on that moment, Chip, if I can interject, one of the complex challenges I'm dealing with as a leader, but also as a mom, is the transition of our schools to distance learning or online learning. And on the surface, it could look like a technical challenge or something that's complicated. Say, all right, you just learn how to operate, via computer instead of in a classroom. But I don't know of more complex organisms than children. And so all these kids are now on this super steep learning curve, as are many of their teachers, right? Who may or may not have tech savviness. So watching this happen and realizing that this is a very complex challenge, and we've been experimenting with a lot of different things at our house, and I'm sure a lot of teachers have too, but that's an interesting complex challenge that I've been in the thick of myself and trying to navigate. What else, Chip?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of great examples all throughout here. And I think that as becoming an adult, so there's some rich examples of both, at work and also personal in here. I would say that, looking through this list of examples, a question comes in for me then about how would you actually start to take this framework and apply it in a real world situation? Let's walk through one of those, because it's rarely that everything is in a situation, even like becoming an adult or raising children, is all complex. There's usually fall into each one of the different domains.
Yeah, it's a really important distinction, and thank you for reminding me. So quite often the challenges we deal with as leaders have elements of all of these domains at play. And I think as a leader, one of the most helpful things you can do is take a step back and identify what lives where and how to approach it and differently. The other thing I'll say, because someone mentioned about becoming an adult, is a topic that we're not touching on today, but if anyone's interested, feel free to follow up with me afterwards. We'll have my contact information. There's a really interesting lens of adult development theory that can be applied on top of this that talks about the different phases of adult development in a really interesting way through these lenses. Okay, so let's talk about preparing your business for the future. So like you said, it's really helpful to apply this to a real thing. And so Chip and I were doing some thinking about this, and we said, well, let's build what it would be like for preparing your business. So in the obvious domain would live things like reporting on key performance indicators and metrics. So this is, you go and you check the data with whatever frequency, and you know that you're going to be able to find it there. Reviewing briefings and newsletters, attending conferences or education programs, anything that's reoccurring and consistent. If you're giving, weekly, daily updates to leadership. That's all in the sort of obvious place. In the complicated space, you'd see things like building new information systems, or identifying new metrics and measures, or creating an internal organization within your organization that is dedicated to identifying emerging trends and signals. So if we're thinking about the future and disruption, how do we know that we can, keep our pulse on what's going on? You could create an organization within yours that just is specifically targeting identifying those emerging trends. Any contingency plans or protocols, that would be also in the land of the complicated. Over in the space of the complex, however, when you think about sort of disruption and the future, any effort that requires aligning your leadership team with the organization, again, now we're talking about human beings, that's complex. Or creating your organization's future strategy and your roadmap forward. So looking at all of the aspects of an organization, the people, the processes, the way things are going to work in concert with one another, where there's going to be interdependencies, transforming your organization. So reorgs is a great example of a really complex challenge. There are aspects that might be complicated in it. So maybe the actual placing of names in boxes on an org chart is fairly straightforward, but you also are dealing with human beings who are going to need to change their way of thinking as a result too. So that's really complex. And certainly anything that is around culture shifts. Culture is a really nuanced thing, and it's really comprised of the way the individuals in an organization show up. So shifting a culture is really complex. And when you're thinking about a future and disruption, how do we prepare for it? How do we become more adaptive, more agile, more flexible so that disruption doesn't throw us off our game? That really requires a shift in culture. And I know many of you are probably parts of organizations that have a very strong sense of culture, and it would be interesting, to hear your thoughts on this. But for any of you who've been responsible or part of having to change culture or evolve our culture initiative, you can imagine, and I'm sure you have experience, it's quite complex. And then finally, in chaos. So suffice to say, given our current circumstances, we've seen quite a bit of this lately, right? So chaos can be created by things like government reactions or mandates. It's like all of a sudden there are new rules at play and the game changed. Or consumer behavior changes. We see a big shift there. That can spark chaos too, because you just have to respond immediately. Supply chain disruption. I would argue that with this current pandemic, one of the implications is around this huge disruption in the supply chain that we both didn't see coming, and we are still only now realizing what the trickle-down effects actually really are. So we're just having to respond immediately. Workforce displacement is another really tragic thing we're seeing as a part of this that's run many into chaos. So that's probably one way I'd think about it. Chip, anything you want to add?
No, I think that this is when the thing that I have reflected on and started to use this model for since you introduced it to me is when we're facing some kind of a challenge, a discussion, something that we're trying to sort out. What are the things that we can, by putting things into the different domains, sitting down and actually mapping that out, it helps to parse out the work, right? What is the work that we can say is complicated, and we can assign that to somebody who's really good at being able to drive down to that kind of level of solution? What is the work that's complex, that is all part of the larger system that we're trying to improve? And it's a remarkably useful model to just use even personally in reflecting upon the big challenges that you're trying to move forward, whether it is personally or in society or at work or whatever it might be.
Yeah, one of the things that occurs to me as you're saying that, Chip, is in my work with leaders and leadership teams, one of the things I have done that I found really useful, I'm just going to share it with you in case it's of use to any of you, is quite often one of the sources of friction on a leadership team has to do with differences in perspectives on what domain we're dealing with. So I've done exercises with intact leadership teams around this, where I simply ask the question of, where do you think this leadership team is spending the most of our time? What kinds of challenges are we dealing with? And it's interesting, the differences in responses uncover a different starting point for our conversation, really, to say, well, I thought what we were dealing with was complicated, and therefore I was throwing process and procedure at it, and I was making protocols and checklists, while someone else is looking at that exact same problem and says, I don't see it that way at all. I see it as highly complex, and I think we need to start running some experiments to learn more. And right there, you kind of uncover a disconnect that sometimes can be the heart of friction on a leadership team. So I've seen this tool be really useful as a conversation starting point for a dialogue that can be really productive.
Well, so building from there, another tool that that you've introduced here to us here at SU is especially useful for helping to manage conversations on teams that are dealing with complex issues, and that's the one of polarities. So let's make a pivot into the polarities conversation and talk a little bit about how we would use that approach and that kind of thinking to be able to help help a leadership team or any team be able to come together around a common problem.
Yes, absolutely. So polarity is really, it's a very straightforward definition. It's two equally desirable things that seem to be in opposition to one another. So I've listed a few of sort of the classic ones here. And a polarity, I want to make a distinction as opposed to a problem that can be solved. A polarity is a dynamic tension that needs to be managed. It's never really solved. So a classic one is quality and speed. So we want things to be of high quality, but we also want to move quickly. It sometimes seems as though we have to compromise on one in order to do the other, or maybe that they're mutually exclusive. You can only do one or the other. This doing what's right for my team versus doing what's right for the entire organization. Well, I'd like to do both. Transparency and safety and security is one we're seeing really alive and at play today. So being open and honest with people, with your team right now, with the public about what's going on, but also maintaining that security and safety. If we're too open, if we're too transparent about what's going on, sometimes we can create panic unintentionally. So how do we hold both of those things in tension? Making fast decisions versus getting consensus. So we want to move quickly, but we also want people to be on board as we do it. That's one I see a lot in leadership teams, and I know I've been part of as well. And then for many entrepreneurs especially, this balance between focusing on the short term and hitting my immediate goals versus keeping an eye on the long term. So those are some examples of polarities. You can see both ends of the poles are desirable and you want both of them, but sometimes it seems like you have to give up one in order to achieve the other. So, but maybe you have examples of polarities too, Chipp and others.
Yeah, and that's a great prompt to ask people again who are listening to go to your chat and put in polarities that you might see around you at work, around you in the world. Love to see some examples of what might be two equally desirable things that seem in opposition to one another that you might be dealing with today. So quality and price, quality versus low price comes in. Centralized versus decentralized. That is
that's a big one.
Big one. That pendulum shifts back and forth all the time, every few years it seems. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Scope versus time to market. Sustainability versus P&L responsibility. Global versus local. Economy versus health. Range versus specialization. Efficiency versus effectiveness. These are great examples.
That's great. Efficiency versus effectiveness is, yes, that's a big one.
They're coming in a little too fast for me to be able to read them, which is okay. That's great. But so I think it seems like people have a good grasp of this concept, right? So now that
so what do we do?
What do we do with it, right? Like, what is the tool to be able to actually make progress when you've identified that there is a polarity at work?
Yeah. So I like to use this map. I've been using it for years. It's very straightforward. Let's take the example of quality and speed, and let's go through this map because I mentioned that polarities are dynamic and it's a tension to be managed. So let's talk about how we do that. So this map is pretty straightforward. We're going to look at each end of the pole sort of one at a time. So on the top of this map, to orient you, in these boxes, we'll add things that are good, benefits of investing in that pole. So if I invest in quality, what's the upside of doing that? What are all the good things I see? On the bottom side is the downside if you overdo it. If you over-index for either end of the pole, what are the downsides that you see? So let's just quickly walk through this one, and then I'll talk about the aspect of the dynamic. So in quality, if we invest in quality, what are the positive things we'll see? Strong brand reputation, we'll have customers who trust us, probably happy end users, products that are reliable. All of that is great. And if we invest in speed, We could be fast to innovate. We could beat our competition to the market maybe, and we learn quickly from fast iterations. However, if we overdo it on quality, what do we see then? If we spend too much on quality, well, we might be slow. We might miss shifts in the landscape, and we might be viewed as not innovative. And on the other end of the pole, if we overdo it on speed, then we could maybe sacrifice quality. We could get sloppy work. We'd have customers who don't really trust us because we seem unreliable. Now, what's interesting about this model is whether you are in the camp quality and that's what you think we should invest in, or speed, it turns out we both want the same thing. So we call that the greatest hope. And similarly, we both want to avoid the bottom side, and we call that the deepest fear. So this dynamic is at play all the time, and we're constantly as leaders kind of navigating these poles. So let's talk a little bit about how you do that. So this is not an infinity loop on an XY axis for any mathematicians out there. This would drive you crazy. Let's just call this a butterfly to get that out of the way. And what's interesting about this is there's this dynamic that occurs with polarities that looks something like this. So we're here, let's say we start in the middle of this map and things are going fine and we're going up to the left. So we're experiencing all of the upsides of investing in quality, and we're doing great. Then we overdo it a little bit. When we overdo it, we dip down to that bottom side. So now we're seeing the downsides of over investing in quality. And when you're in that bottom quadrant, you tend to get tunnel vision to the opposite corner. So when we're down there, all we can think about is needing to see the upsides of speed. So we launch ourselves in that direction, and we're humming along just fine there, but then we tend to overdo it. And you can see how this cycle evolves. Now we're experiencing the downsides of speed. And again, when we're in that downside, all we can see is how desperately we need to be seeing the upside of quality. So we slingshot ourselves back. So this kind of butterfly effect of this like loop begins to form a pattern. And that's the dynamic nature of polarities. We're sort of constantly trying to underdo it. So if we know that this dynamic exists, then the next question is, well, what do we do to try to strike the right balance? Because at the beginning I mentioned, as opposed to a problem that can be solved, polarities aren't really things that can be solved. It's always going to be changing because the landscape around us is changing. So what do we do to know how to react to the dynamic? One of the things that I have found most helpful is getting really good at identifying the early signals that we may have dipped below that line and are starting to experience the downside. Because when we can do that, we can course correct in a way that enables us to spend more time on the upside and less time on the downside. So, so it looks like this, and I call it raising the butterfly. So instead of having a butterfly that's squarely in the middle, where you're spending equal times on top or bottom, or more time on the bottom than on the top, which can sometimes happen too, if we really finely tune our ability to identify those early warning signals that we've dipped just below that line, then we can make more micro course corrects that will keep us from overdoing it on the other side. So the trick is not about getting the perfect balance and setting it and saying we're done. It's about paying attention to all the indicators in the system to be able to see those early warning signals. And when I say early warning signals, I think about things that may be more subtle. So in an organizational setting, what are the things you're hearing in the hallway? What's the vibe? What are people chatting about, off in a corner? What's the buzz that you're beginning to hear? In larger contexts, it could be, what are the headlines we're beginning to see? What are we noticing trends in the marketplace? Where are we seeing little things happening that might be signals that we've dipped below? And what might we be able to do to course correct? And you can see that the way I'm talking about it requires an ability to step out of the middle of it so you can actually see these signals. And I actually think that's one of the hardest things, is like being able to step outside enough so you can notice those signals. But it's also one of the most valuable things, because when you see them, then you can start making those course corrections. So that's one of the things that I like about this model, is like there are ways to improve it while still honoring the fact that it's a dynamic sort of tension to be managed.
And I think that's such an interesting point here, because it's the idea of the dynamic tension to be managed, and what you mentioned about the conversations in the hallway. You use the terms greatest hope and greatest fear, or deepest fear. Fear is a really complicated or complex emotion to be able to manage, right? And when I look at this, it makes a lot of sense, obviously, from an analytical standpoint, and we can all sit here kind of dispassionately and say, yes, I see how polarities works, and I'm committed to be able to bring this into my organization. But when we start to deal with fear, that is not something that, we can just use a 2x2 and put in front of a group and say, see, you shouldn't be worried. Fear drives us to do a lot of things that are perhaps non-logical. So how do you deal with that? Because that to me feels like one of the greatest challenges of implementing any kind of a framework like this is just overcoming the fear component of change, or of seeing something that you're worried is a threat to your job or your company or your success. And managing through that is its own challenge. So what are your thoughts on how to approach that?
It's a really good question, and one that I think sometimes gets overlooked. And I often get asked, as someone who works in the field of leadership development, as we look at the future, what's going to be most important for leaders from like a skill set mindset perspective? And my answer has been pretty consistent, and the answer is empathy. And the reason I say that is one of the most critical things that is important to do when you're dealing with complex challenges is honing your ability to see things from different perspectives. So one of the things I like about this model is thinking about, from a polarity perspective, if I am really strongly in one end of the pole or the other, chances are there are people who are just as strongly on the opposite end. And what's interesting about this dynamic is when you get really emotionally triggered by these things, when there's lots of heat around this for teams and for organizations, for leaders, we tend to get tunnel vision and just only focus on our perspective. And one of the most valuable and important things we can do when we're in that place is actually to take this walk to the people who are on the other side of the pole, sit in their shoes, and not just understand their perspective, but actually viscerally get a sense for their lived experience. So what are their pressures they're under? What are their greatest fears? What has led them to be on this side of the pole? What are they noticing in the system that is speaking loudly to them that you may not be seeing at all? And that ability to take that walk and sit in someone else's shoes and really get a felt sense of what's going on for them from their perspective is so valuable. One of the reasons is it's only by doing that can you see that whether you're in camp, speed, or quality, you actually both want the same thing. And it's a really powerful thing. And having worked with leadership teams and doing sort of interactive kind of experiences with them around this, I'll tell you, it's amazing to see the different starting point in the conversation when we've taken a moment to say, what does it feel like for you to be in this quadrant? And what put you here? And what are your deepest fears around it? Because when we understand different perspectives, then we can take different action that's far more productive.
So let's walk through an example of something that a lot of the polarity that's really happening in the world around us. And this
Yes.
idea of running our day-to-day business versus preparing for disruptive events.
Yeah, I think this is particularly relevant. So let's talk about that. The upside, let's start with the upside of preparing for disruptive events. So if you focus on doing that, your business is likely to be more future-proof, right? Because we know there's going to be more disruption in the future. You're building an organization that's more resilient to the shocks in the system, and you can respond quickly to emerging disruptions. Those are all great things. And similarly, if we invest in running our day-to-day business, and that's what we focus on, we're going to meet our short-term goals and financial targets. We'll deliver on all of our operational metrics. We'll have efficiency in the system. We'll probably keep our existing customers happy. But if we go back over to the preparing for disruptive events side, if we overdo that, then it could look like not delivering on next quarter's expectations because we kind of took our eye off the ball. We could stop innovating the core of the business when we don't focus on it. And we might waste money making plans that we actually never use. We're just too behind this guy out there. And on the flip side, if we run our day-to-day business, well, and we focus too heavily on that, we could be blindsided by this disruptive events. We could find ourselves in that cliff where we end up in chaos because we're not focusing on what's going on around us. We're just focusing on day-to-day. We could also lose the ability to navigate the uncertainty that's to come. We could, fail to think strategically or long-term. And as a result, we could miss some market trends. So you can see that there are upsides and downsides to both. And this is a tension to constantly be managed. And certainly as I've worked with organizations in different phases of growth, this looks really different. And what's required at those different phases of growth are really different too. But what I do know is having leadership who can identify these things and be aware of them and have conversations about them puts you in a much more likely place to be able to build resiliency and bounce back from this disruption.
So
What would you add, Chipp?
I'm imagining a lot of people on this call are wrestling with an issue that might look like this, or a myriad of other polarities that we saw pop up in our chat. So what are some concrete steps that a leader could take in order to be able to move forward in implementing the idea of polarities, some of the steps around complexity? Like, what should people do next coming out of this this conversation?
Yeah, I think a few takeaways here. So I've talked about a lot, but let's just simplify it to a few key things that would be helpful potentially going forward for all of you. So use the Cynefin Model. It's available out there. You can search it up and use it to identify the complex challenges that are going on in your organization that maybe you've been treating as complicated and you now see the distinction. And see if there are pieces of that challenge that fall into each of those domains. So anything like reorgs, restructuring, change management efforts have lots of elements that fall into those different domains. Just taking a moment to ask yourself what polarities you're seeing in your organization. And then maybe think of the most heated one. Go to a place where there's lots of friction and tension and disagreement, and see if you can start to identify what those early warning signals are on both ends of the pole. Map it out. See if you can find opportunities to better understand someone's perspective that's different from yours, especially if it's a source of conflict. So see if you can really challenge yourself to take yourself out of your point of view and really adopt a different person's perspective. And then lastly, maybe this idea of getting on the balcony is so critical. So take a step back from that complex challenge that you're swimming in the middle of and see if you can get a holistic view. What are the people, what are the teams, the organizations, what pressures are at play? Notice those interdependencies and how they're connected, and see if you can start designing some experiments to help you learn more. So those are a few tangible things. I could talk for days about this, but I know we're short on time, so I want to be sure to get to some questions. Last thing I'll say is for those of you who are interested in going a bit deeper, this is a great book. Jennifer Garvey Berger and Keith Johnston. I've worked with them in the past. They're wonderful humans, and they've written a really helpful book that I find useful because it takes a very theoretical, complex idea and puts it into tangible actions you can use. So feel free to do that. And then the last thing I'd say is, I saw this quote not long ago, just a couple weeks ago, and I found it pretty powerful, especially with what's going on right now. Your perspective is the most powerful thing you can control in a situation that's beyond your control. And I think especially now more than ever, honing our understanding of complexity and how to navigate these uncertain times is going to require us to adopt different perspectives. So that would probably be my highest hope for this. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much, Catherine. It looks like we have a few minutes left here to get to some of the questions that have come in over the last hour. So Jesse, you have popped back up here on the screen.
I have, yes. Thank you.
Hello.
So if the two of you have a few more minutes, maybe we can go over. Otherwise, we'll try to push through the end of the top of the hour. But we have a lot of questions. We have a question from Steve Beckett. Could you name some specific leadership quality or capabilities that leaders need to work with complexity, i.e. perspective taking?
Yeah, I think part of perspective taking is actually listening differently. So one of the things that I think we don't spend a whole lot of time on as leaders, or at least I'll say I don't spend a lot of time focusing, is actually paying attention to how we're listening. And when we talk about empathy and taking different perspectives, one of the most important things you can do is listen with the 100% focused intent of understanding the other person's perspective. It is much harder than it sounds to do, but it requires getting out of your own head. So how can I, if Chipp and I are in a dialogue and he has a really different opinion to me and maybe I vehemently disagree with it, how can I put for a moment aside my perspective? Doesn't mean I'm abandoning it or saying it's not valid, but for a moment put it off to the side and just 100% focus on trying to deeply understand Chipp's lived experience of that thing. That's one of the most critical things we can do. I also think staying in touch with, so being able to see the system is one thing. One of the things that you can see when you get out of the middle of something and you see those interconnectivities is who are those individuals who are really influential, who may or may not have authority by position or power, but who, when they open their mouth, people listen. So find those people, stay in touch with them, because those are the people who are going to be able to help you identify those early warning signals that I talked about. So being able to see the system, but also the people in the system and how they're interplayed are a few. I could go on, but those are a couple that come to mind. Chipp, anything to add?
Yeah, I wanted to build on that with the idea of open-mindedness. I mean, that is actually a skill to build, and a really helpful tool to be able to work on open-mindedness in the world of complexity is when you hear an idea, when somebody comes to you with a suggestion, first thing you do is think about the reasons that's a good idea or reason it's a good suggestion. You know, our natural response is to try and immediately look for the problems with it, but take a minute, take a step back. Here are the reasons, the 3 reasons that you think that this idea or a perspective has merit before moving into a mindset of what are the gaps that you see that keep it from being perfect. So not what are the problems with it, why is it a bad idea? What are the gaps that you see that you need to think through with the person that would help it to become a more perfect path to follow? And you know, I think about that as like a balanced feedback model, but getting into the practice of that is a really useful way of ensuring that you're listening to people with an open mind, which is so much about what you need to have to operate in that complex domain versus a mindset of being able to quickly make decisions about what's in or out, which is something that, again, we've been developed through our lives of living in complicated domains.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So we have another question. Is there sometimes 3 poles instead of 2 poles? For instance, in business, there's price, quality, and lead time.
Yeah. Yes, of course. I think the way to apply this model is to think about what are you noticing. I mean, I've seen lots of permutations of this model. I, for my own head, try to simplify things to get it down to 2 that I can sort of understand. But yes, quite often you have multiple things at play. I think it's about being able to identify when you've overdone it in any of those, right? And what are you noticing as a result? Identifying them as a polarity of this end or that end brings a sort of a simplicity to it to enable you to kind of map it out. So in the case where you see 3 things at play, I think it would be really interesting to take them sort of 2 at a time and see if you can map out what happens when you overdo it on one versus the other. So maybe it's cost, maybe it's quality, maybe it's speed, but what if you take just cost and quality or just speed and quality and map those out? Chip, what would you add?
I think it's a great question. And
yeah,
I mean, you get past 3, it becomes really hard to represent on a paper. But I think that
this is true.
The idea that there might be multiples, and I think that the important thing that I hear in that question is not oversimplifying challenges. But there might be 3 or 4 or 5 things that are at play, and trying to listen for that faint signal of what might be the underlying issue that is really driving the conversation, but we might not be aware of because we might not have language to describe it, or it might not be something that has come up in conversation previously. Continuing to be aware of what other things might be at play here. You know, I mean, it's an n-axis model if you want it to be. I think the most important thing, as Catherine was saying, is honoring each one of those and really spending the time to identify what is the greatest hope, what is the deepest fear, and acknowledging that we all want all of the greatest hopes of all of those and really put the problem solving towards how we achieve that.
Yeah.
Great. So we're running out of time, but I think that there was one question that kind of tugged at my personal heartstrings. It was from Moto Z. He was having a conversation with his daughter and she said, "Papa, you told me nothing's impossible. So now, you know, we have this issue of COVID in the world and a vaccine is taking so much time and humanity is looking at God to intervene. Do we need a different level or leadership quality who can connect the dots better before and guide us through this?"
So at the risk of getting political, yes. So I would argue that in these times, we need leadership more than ever. And we need leaders who can see these things from multiple perspectives. I will share a personal anecdote that occurred early in this crisis for me before we knew the magnitude of this. And living in California, we took pretty drastic measures pretty early on. And many of us, myself included, were wondering if that was really necessary, right, at the beginning of this crisis. And I paused for a moment and I put myself in the shoes of my dear friend and neighbor who has a husband who's immunocompromised. And I thought, you know, from her perspective, this is way, way more scary than it is from mine. And if I take a moment to think about what this is like for her and her lived experience of this, absolutely, we need to take these precautions and all necessary. And what I wish I saw more of right now in our world leaders was this ability to see all of the different perspectives in this instead of just their own. Because I think what's happened is, you know, on that Cynefin map, that center of disorder in the middle, I think we've seen a bit of that. And part of the reason we have is there hasn't been a coordinated approach. There hasn't been an ability for people to have a shared understanding of what domain we're really dealing with, right? We had a lot of arguments among governments about how big of a deal it is or not. I would love to see a more coordinated effort, and I would love to see more empathy in the system from our leaders, and just a shared understanding of what's going on. But it's a great question, and you know, as a parent, yeah, this is a really difficult thing to explain. What would you add, Chipp?
You know, I would. This is a great question, and we could do a whole other webinar on it.
Yes.
The thing that I think, the thing that comes to mind for me with that question is, I think we're living in a world that that is a lived example of something that's very complex, that has been managed as if it's complicated for far too long. And you know, when you look at the decisions that have been made over not just, you know, these last few months, but over decades, that have resulted in the very, you know, fragile systems that we have that exist. That is, you know, I think very consistent with the idea that people have been looking for the right answer and thinking that there is a right answer, versus preparing for a world that is complex and will sometimes be chaotic. So I don't think it's a short answer, but like, I know one of my greatest hopes that we learn out of this is the importance of really viewing the world as a system, and viewing the world that we want to build as a complex challenge that is worth undertaking, even though it's going to be difficult, even though it's going to be messy, even though there's not a single formula that we're going to be able to use to come up with an optimal solution. That's the work that's worth doing in the world right now.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Catherine, if you could forward to our last slide. There we go, right there. So we've had, I think, roughly around 390 people attend today, which is awesome. And I think we had over 1,000 people register. But we actually need your help now. So Singularity University is planning to launch the first truly global learning and innovation community platform that will bring individuals and organizations together to create powerful connections and opportunities to learn and create lasting impact and change throughout the world. So we'd love to hear from you and get your feedback. So if you're open to going to chat.su.org/survey and to walk through that survey, you know, we built it in a way that's engaging, so you can provide your input and feedback. In return for that, as we launch this new platform in the next few months, we're going to give you early access to it so that we can get your feedback as well. So this new platform's a new way to engage and interact with people just like you that's attended this, and the thousands of others that have attended SU programs over the last 11 years that we've been in existence. So we appreciate your engagement today, and wish everybody a wonderful afternoon or evening wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.